All right, we're going to begin with this the review. We're going to do this a couple times, just again give you a couple extra days to get it, let it sink in, and but it also leads into what we're going to talk about tonight. So everybody ready? Everybody's like, oh no, do we have to? Here we go. Creation, fall, flood, nations. 4,000 years ago, Persian Gulf, Saul, Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah, Tigris, Euphrates, Haran, Terah dies. Sea Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, Jews, Egypt, 400 years, bondage. Moses, there's no echo. There's no echo, sorry. Moses, let my people go. No, 10 plagues, Passover, Red Sea, Mount Sinai, law, tabernacle, Levites and priests, offerings and feasts, counting the faces, Kadesh, oasis, 12 spies, wanders, dies. Moab, Moses, second law, dies. Joshua, Jordan River, Jericho, divides, conquers, south, north, divides, settles, 12 tribes. Judges, 400 years. Deborah, Gideon, Samson. Okay, we're just, I'm not hearing it from you guys. Samson. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes except Ruth and Samuel. United Kingdom, 120 years. Saul, no heart. David, whole heart. Solomon, half heart. Divided kingdom, 400 years. North, south, Israel, Judah, 1920, 08. Prophets speak, shape up or ship out. Assyria, Israel scatters. Babylon, Judah exiles. 70 years. Persia, Judah returns. Zerubbabel, temple. Esther, queen. Ezra, people. Nehemiah, walls. 400 years, silence, Christ. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about how not so silent those silent years were. Again, it's a description for that. I do hope you have a half sheet. Anybody not? Because there's a lot, and I hope you all love history. Because there's a lot of history happening here. Anybody need that? Okay. If you would, and we're just going to look at a brief passage, Daniel chapter 2. I put a lot of references there, so you can on your own read about that and stuff. But even though basically the silent years are what happens after Nehemiah and up until Christ. And the thing is, even though it's called the silent years, in that there was no scripture being written, some people mistakenly think God's doing nothing, but he was very active. And you know what? We're between the last part of the New Testament, awaiting the second coming. Let me ask this question. Is God doing nothing? Is God not still working? And in the same way, God worked in that time. Yes, there were miracles. There are some books that are in the Apocrypha that give a history of this time period called the Maccabees, First and Second Maccabees. There's a third and fourth, but they kind of go off. And they're not scripture, but they're good history. So I wanted to read on my own, first of all, Galatians 4:4. Galatians 4:4 says this, "But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights as sons." That passage, I love that passage because it kind of is a great description of when the time had fully come, when God set all the pieces up, when the board was ready, when ready to play, all of these things got set up. It's in these silent years that God is working. He's working in the world. He's working specifically in Israel as well. And so I want us to look just real briefly at Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of Babylon, who was responsible for conquering Judah and then exile, he has Daniel, and again, we're not going to go into the whole story. Daniel is a Jew that went there as a boy, as well as his friends. And Daniel has a dream, and he wants to know what the dream means. And so he says, you've got to tell me not only what my dream means, but you got to tell me my dream. And so God reveals that to Daniel. And so I'm gonna read verse 31. And there's other images, and I'm just going to mention them. So verse 31, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image or statue. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces, and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." And so now he goes into the interpretation. We're not going to read that because I'm going to be teaching that. But he goes into the interpretation basically saying, okay, first of all, these are the kingdoms that are coming in this time. And he says, you, Nebuchadnezzar, you're that head of gold. Your country, your nation. Because these were like the major world powers of that time. And starting with Babylon. And so he goes and says, all right, and then these other subsequent parts, the chest and the silver arms, the silver chest and arms are the next kingdom. And then you have the bronze waist, and that's the next kingdom coming. And then you have finally the legs of iron that slowly go to iron and clay as well, are the next kingdom, which are followed by the kingdom of Christ coming. And it's still, I'd love to say, that when the stone struck, it all went away like that. But no, we're still in the thralls. But we're not going to go into all those details and the impact of these nations on the world even today. But ultimately, Christ's kingdom will fully come, and these will all be done away. So you have the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2. I just read the part that he describes what that dream was. Then in chapter 7, you have the beast of Daniel's dream. Let me just read real quickly, verse 17 and 18. "The four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth. but the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. It's basically the same dream, but instead of parts of a statue, it's 4 different visions of different animals coming up. And so again, I'm just going to refer to that, what the animal is as we go. And then Daniel has a vision in Daniel chapter 8. And in this, there's just 2 animals, and they picture 2 of the kingdoms, first of all warring, and then what happens after that. So we're going to break it down and just go through, okay, here's the kingdom. Here's the kingdom of Babylon, which is that head of gold, and the beast like a lion. There was a lion that was there. One of the things to note, the metals decrease in value. Gold, silver, bronze, iron. They decrease in value. There's a lesserness in that way. When you look at the king, Nebuchadnezzar could say whatever he wanted to say, and then it was done. So be it. So let it be written. So let it be done. And it just was. It was that way. The next kingdom, it wasn't quite as firm of a reign. It was, if the king made a law, you got to live by the law of the Medes and Persians. And that comes up in the story of Ruth and stuff like that. So the king is under the law, which again, I think that's good, but just in as to supreme power, stuff like that. Then the next one, there was definitely, the kingdom was not based on descendants of the first king, but it was lesser, and they had to hold their position with power, or else they would lose them being king. And then you get to Rome, or the last kingdom, made of iron and stuff like that. And again, it turns to be very brittle. And yet, here's another thing about that: you go from the softest metal to the hardest metal. And the impact that each one has. But again, no matter what, the stone comes and it's gone. And no matter how powerful or how valuable or whatever. So you have Babylon, and we already know the story of Babylon. It's kind of not so much the silent years, but we kind of need to know the story, because they're the ones who came in and took Judah and exiled them in 3 different waves, and then really they're gone before the Old Testament is over. But let me just say, here's some of the things that impacted what's going on with the Jews with Babylon. What are some of the things? And again, this is just I could spend a week on each one of these, but we're trying to get an overview, okay? So we have an overview of 400 years tonight. First of all, there was no more temple. The last time that Babylon came to Judea, they came, they destroyed the walls and the temple, and so that was their religious identity. I mean, you can't worship God without the temple. They used to have a tabernacle, and that would travel around with them, or could be in. But then it became a permanent structure at the time of David and Solomon. But that was their identity. What do you do now that we no longer have a central? We have one God. We don't have multiple gods and multiple temples. How do you do that? And also no more temple, and they're also away from their land. I mean, talk about a total loss of identity. What do you do to hold together of us being a people, the people of Israel? Well, this is what developed, the development of the synagogue. Before, everybody always goes to Jerusalem. You always go to the temple. You always do your sacrifices there and stuff like that. But what do you do when there's no temple? We still gather. We still assemble. That's what the Hebrew word, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, just means house of the assembly. It was a place of prayer, a place of study. It was a social gathering place. It was a welfare agency where goods were collected and dispensed. And so one of the things that changed is that their religious life wasn't as dependent on location. And so wherever you are, and you got a bunch of other Jews, you could have a synagogue. Brand new. I mean, we go to the New Testament and we're like, oh, those have always been around. No, this is when they were developed because they were away from home. They were gone and stuff like that. And when they came back to Jerusalem, it continued and continues. To this day, it continues. All right, that's Babylon. That's, again, it's not so much the silent years. Then you go to Medo-Persia. This is the chest and arms of silver in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It was a beast like a bear in Daniel 7:5. And let me just read a verse here. Verse 7:5. It says, "And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.'" Now you're going, wow, what a weird dream. There's kind of like a bear, and he's kind of sideways on it because there's a stronger kingdom and a weaker kingdom together and stuff like that. So what happened? Persia pretty much overthrew, but yet joined with the Medes. And then combined together, they were now the powerhouse. They came in and wiped out Babylon. Now, if you remember our map, where you have Persian Gulf and you have the Tigris Strait, this was Babylon, and they also came down and took this area, but that's about as far as Babylon got. Then you have the Medo-Persian Empire, and they actually started. Got to get my directions here. They started over here, and they had that area, and they came over and they conquered, Babylon. Then they came and then they also, took basically everything that was Babylon, which included Israel. But then they started expanding. They started expanding into Egypt, as well as, now I got to go this way, into Europe. They first conquered the area that you would call Asia Minor, and then they crossed into Europe, into a place called Macedonia. And they had some victories there that later on people would remember from that area, go, oh, we're going to get them back. But that's the next country. So you have Medo-Persia. Some of their story, again, is in the Old Testament, when you have Cyrus the Great, who is the one who issued the decree that the Jews can go back and rebuild their temple and stuff like that. But if you see the dates there, they were around for 200 years. And so what is going on during this time of Medo-Persia? One of the things is there are no longer prophets. At least as far as we know. I'm not saying that no one ever said, "Thus saith the Lord," but there wasn't anything with the authority behind. And then there was also a need. There was a need to apply the scriptures for today. They wanted instruction as to how can we make the law of God into our lives today. How do we live it out? Ezra came and he built up the people. And there's this beautiful story of him standing up and reading the Word of God. And at the same time, there were these other people around that started explaining to them, what does this mean? And how do you apply it? And it was kind of a real neat story of what was going on. And in this time period, again, because, you have what's called the scribes. The scribes were the scholars, the people who really knew the word. And they would copy, they copied it, they translated it, and they expounded the scriptures. You also have rabbis come up to teach and disciple people. You also have what's called the development of the midrash. Now, I'll tell you what the midrash is not. It's not when you've rubbed up against a plant on your belly and you have a scratch right here, okay? That's a midrash, but this is not that. So the midrash was an attempt because, okay, if you've just watched your nation or just heard all the stories about your nation being totally, one of them just totally scattered and the other one exiled and went 70 years and all that, you're going, how can we keep that from happening again? How do we stop that from doing that? There were 613 laws in the Torah. Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. 613. It was the goal of the midrash was to set a hedge around the laws. An insulation where you're not getting anywhere close to breaking the laws. And the way they did that was, let's make a law. Let's make a series of laws so that you don't get even close to breaking this one law. And they started going back and forth. This is the scribes and the scholars and all that. Okay, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? You know, and they make all these different laws. Well, then they say, well, what does it mean to not hunt? You know, and they make laws about that. And you know, again, more and more of it's kind of, again, the goal was, we don't want to break the law, so let's, you know, it's kind of like, okay, what's the law? 55 miles an hour. They were driving 25, okay? So they were like, how can we keep from ever breaking the law? Well, again, it's impossible because we're sinful. And so this actually developed other sin. And so is the development of the midrash. This is what Jesus had to talk about all the time. He called it the traditions of men. That it wasn't the law. It wasn't what God had given them. And again, the desire was good, and we have to be very, very careful that if we ever make a rule to say, you can never do this when the Bible doesn't say don't. You just got to be very careful that we do not add to God's word. And this is what happened here. And initially, great motivation. Later, it came about of, look how good I am. I'm better than you. You know, you only keep the 613. I keep the 5,000. So anyway, so during this time of the Medo-Persian, these are the things that are developing. Okay.
Where do the Pharisees fit?
We're coming to them. They're later on. Jumping ahead, Mike. I don't know if I should give you a star or an X. Anyway. So, the next major power is Greece. Again, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, this is the waist of bronze. In Daniel chapter 7, this is the beast like a leopard. Let me just read verse 6. It says, after that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. Leopard's pretty fast. Okay, well, let's make it faster. And on its back it had 4 wings like that of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. Later on in the next chapter, this is one of the 2 animals. It was a goat with 1 horn initially. Okay, and then it's the one that went against the ram with 2, and that was Medo-Persia getting gone because of this. Now, if you remember, I said that when the Medo-Persians were expanding, they crossed the line and into what was called Macedonia, which was part of Greece. And there's some famous battles that I can't pronounce, Thermopylae or something like that. Yes, he got it. And the Battle of Marathon, all these different things that happened in that time. And some of them were losses, and it was kind of like the Alamo. You know, remember what Wayne said. Remember that. And so when Greece started growing in power, and there started to be some generals that really knew what to do, like a guy named Philip of Macedon. He started having victory against the Medes and Persians. But he died, so his son took over. His name was Alexander, and he was great as a general. I won't say it any other way. But and so this is Alexander the Great, and basically everything that used to be what was Babylon and then became Medo-Persia plus some, he basically conquered all of it and conquered it quickly. In fact, most of it wasn't even battles. It was like Alexander's coming. Okay, wave the white flag. It's like we surrender. And so we got a lot to cover. So I'm just got to keep going. So Alexander, basically had all these victories and some of that, and he was that goat. He was that one horn of that goat which broke off and was replaced by 4. Remember that leopard also had 4 heads. When he died, his 4 generals took over. And they basically broke the kingdom into four places.
There's a little horn with a big mouth.
Yeah, well, that's I can't go into all the detail, okay, and that's also from Revelation. But so Daniel 11, boy, when you read that, you're going to go, and the king of the north did this, and the king of the south did this, and the king of the north had married one of the daughter of the king of the south, blah, 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 blah. What in the world is going on? Well, let me just tell you, and I didn't put any of this on your note, you had and it's spelled with a PT, but we just pronounced the T, the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy was Ptolemy the First was one of the generals, and then you had the Seleucid dynasty, and that's one of the other general, and most of them weren't called Seleucid, they were called Antiochus, and so you have year after year and generation after generation of these people. The Ptolemies were down in Egypt. The Seleucids were up in basically the Babylon area, and they met in the middle. Guess what the middle was? Is what was formerly known as Israel. And so when you're reading Daniel chapter 11, it's going back and forth, and what's happening is the border keeps shifting. And Judah is sometimes, okay, now we're under Ptolemy's rule. Oh no, now we're under Antiochus's rule. And it goes back and forth and stuff. And it's known, basically, when you read Daniel 11, there's the king of the south and the king of the north. And so that's just a brief history until they overstepped their bound and something else happened, which is going to be the next thing. So what's preparing the world for Jesus to come? With Greece. One of the things that Alexander did when he conquered, and he conquered quickly, he didn't have this request. He had this demand on these city-states that were saying, we surrender, we don't want to fight you and all that. He says, all right, you've got to adopt my culture, you've got to take our coin, and you've got to take our language. And so there was a connection. What prepared the world for Christ and the spread of Christ was there was a common culture called Hellenism. If you've ever heard of Helen of Troy, that's what it's named after. That happened a few hundred years before. You had a common coin and you had a common language, which was the Greek language of that day. And so that connected because that was still in place hundreds of years later in the time of Jesus and in the time of the book of Acts. So that started preparing because, again, with a common culture, you could connect better with people when you went from one town to another. Yes, there was some issues there. We'll talk about it in just a second. And good old Pharisees. And having the same coinage helped you in travel, as well as no matter where Paul went, no matter who read Paul's letters or James's letters or Peter's letters, it was in that Greek language that people knew. Everybody knew it. So, what's going on with the Jews, with Greece? You have one thing called the diaspora that's happening. What is the diaspora? It is the dispersion of the Jews. This really began in a small way with Babylon. Remember, Babylon took Judea and exiled them. And then there were the returns. But guess what? Not everybody returned. They just stayed there and yeah, we like it here. And they did their work. We have our own synagogue. And they did their own work and all that. And so, but when the Medo-Persian Empire came in, Jews spread out more and more and more all throughout this land. Again, it was a big area that was conquered, and so when they spread what their beliefs are. Again, they're no longer tied to a temple. And so what you have is the spread of synagogues. Again, if you read the book of Acts, you have Paul walking into most of the cities, not all the cities, and he could find a synagogue. He began there and sharing the gospel there. There was also an increase of what was called God-fearers. God-fearers were non-Jews who said, there's something about your God. We believe on him. Okay? Now, let me read from the book of Acts chapter 2. Verse 5 says this, Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. Well, how did the Jews get all over the place? The diaspora. Going down to verse 9, it starts listing them. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, which is Asia Minor, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, these God-fearers, the Cretans and the Arabs. And so how did all these Jews get spread out? During this period of time, when it was the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, what else happened during this time? You had what's called the Septuagint was written. It is the Greek Old Testament. It made the Bible, the Old Testament, available to anybody who could read Greek, which in that time was anybody who could read. Okay? So you also had Jewish divisions happen. When Alexander started the policy of everybody's of Hellenization, changing the culture to be like no matter where you go. Well, guess what? The Jews didn't like that. But some did. You had people that were pro-Hellenism and you had people who were anti-Hellenism. And so I'm going to talk about them in the next group, but there became a division because of this. But at the end of this period of Greece, and again, if you read chapter 11, it spells out this whole history, even though you don't know who they're talking about. I have spoken on that before. Antiochus IV, his treatment of the Jews. This is when that part, the Seleucid part, came down and were conquering them. He forbid Jewish practices like circumcision, sacrifices, and celebrating feast days on penalty of death. He destroyed many scriptures. He desecrated the temple. He erected at the temple an altar devoted to Zeus. He sacrificed swine on the altar. He forced priests to make unlawful sacrifices, and what this led to was a Jewish rebellion and an independence. So you have a Jewish independence that happens. And that's the next part. And again, I'm putting the years next to it. I haven't said those out, but we're starting now in 167 BC, going to 63 BC. So there became an independence that the Jews won that lasted over 100 years. And so things are happening. So basically there was a priest, and he was being forced to do a sacrifice. He refused to do it. Someone else stepped in to do it, and he killed him. Menelaus I think was his name. And then that started, and then they had to flee, and they were kind of hidden in the hills. They're like the Robin Hood of the day. They were hiding in the hills and attacking and doing guerrilla warfare and all that stuff, and stuff. And then he died, and then his son Judas took over. This was a good Judas. Judas Maccabeus was his name. Judas the Hammer is what it means. And he put his hammer down, and he fought against. They had great victories. They won their independence. In this story, this is where Hanukkah comes, because in the defiling of the temple, it was like, all the oil was all gone, and they were trying to get the temple worship going again, but there was only enough oil for a day, and so they lit it, and it stayed lit for 8 days, and so that's why Hanukkah, happens and stuff like that. So again, celebrating that relighting of the light in the temple, and again, the story goes on, but unfortunately, it gets ugly because politics gets involved. And politics is always ugly. I don't care what side you're on. So you had some people vying for leadership positions, and so some of them tried to get some of the political people, which were still the Greeks over here, and they're like, no. And then they started reaching over to Rome, which was a growing power, and hey, well, we'll be buddies with you if I could be the high priest. And so you had stuff and junk like this starting to happen. And again, I can't go into all the details, but during this period, what's developing in the Jews? What's developing with the Jews? Well, okay, going back to the Jewish divisions. Again, just like earlier, I said earlier, you had pro-Hellenist and anti-Hellenists, okay? So you have two groups listed here. The Essenes and the Pharisees are in the anti-Hellenism. We need to stay true to what the Bible says our culture should be like. The Essenes would be what you would call separatists, okay? They're going, this thing is too messed up. We're leaving. We're camping out in the desert. And that's kind of what they did around the Dead Sea. In fact, that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, this group. You won't find them mentioned by name in the New Testament, but they were around during that time. But they're like, we've given up on the Jewish community. Let's go away and have our own little community. You have the Pharisees, which I would equate to the Puritans. Okay, let's stay within the system and let's try to purify it. Let's try to get it back to what it was. And again, they were really big on the midrash. Again, trying to obey not just the law, but the laws around the law. And again, that's why they became a problem. Then you have on the other side of the fence of being a pro culture of Greek were the Sadducees. They embraced change. Whether it be political change or cultural change. And because they did this, they got to be the ones in power. Because whether it was Greece or later Rome, they knew how to rub elbows with and adjust to. And that's where they were in Jesus' day, the political power behind the Jewish system. So you had Jewish divisions. You had an expansion of Jewish territory during this 100 years of Jewish territory. Initially, all they had was Jerusalem and a little bit of land around it. Well, during this period of time, they grew Judea more and more into the Judea area. They went to Edom and took over that area. In fact, they fought against some Edomites, and there was bad blood there. And this other guy named Herod came from Edom, but that's a whole other story. You had Samaria; they conquered and destroyed a temple that was built in the Greek period. The Transjordan, meaning across the Jordan side. Basically they're trying to take over what God had originally given them. And then they reached out into what was called Galilee of the Gentiles. And they built up, it's kind of like they moved in and settled, and that's how they conquered areas. And they're still doing it today. And then even into what was the Philistine, the coastal areas. And so during this period of Jewish independence, it just expanded. During this period, the ancestors of Joseph and of Mary moved to Galilee. And even during that period, it was still primarily a Jewish region. And stuff. So you're like wondering, hey, how some of the other areas were lost, like Samaria and stuff like that. But so you have an expansion of Jewish territory. You have an increasing Roman influence that's going to set up for the next time period. But in this, you had an increased messianic hope. There's going to be one that's going to purify us from the Greeks. And then the next group. And there's going to be one who's going to purify us from the Romans. And they just kept growing. So during this period, Rome, that final iron legs, monstrous beast, the legs of iron, the beast with iron teeth, came in. They took over. They again worked with the political powers to be. You've heard of Pompey. You had the original triumvirate, which was Pompey, Caesar, and no one else remembers the other name. See, okay. So again, they were actually a political issue going on there. And then Julius Caesar actually ended up, getting rid of the other ones. And he says, I'm the emperor, I'm the emperor. And that lasted just a few months till the Ides of March. And then he was killed. Then you had another triumvirate, which is Mark Antony and Octavian and somebody else that nobody remembers. So during this period of the legs of iron and the beasts of the iron teeth, what is preparing the world for Christ? The Greeks connected the world with their culture, their coin, and their language. Rome was God's instrument to spread the word. How did God use, this power, this monster with iron teeth? Well, there's this thing called the Peace of Rome. The Peace of Rome. It was a forced peace. It was, you better stay peaceable or else. That's the Peace of Rome. But during that period, because there was the Peace of Rome, now yes, there were rebellions here and there and stuff like that, but the overall Peace of Rome made it peaceful. It made it where the gospel could expand easier because of that. There are instances in the book of Acts where a riot is getting ready to happen that may get Paul killed, and it's a Roman leader who says, watch out, guys, we're going to be accused of a riot. We will not have that happen. And it calmed it down. It's interesting that God used this to keep the gospel going out. Later, Rome wasn't very that thrilled about it. But then you also had the Peace of Rome. You have the roads of Rome. They connected the world. So it was not such a hard thing to go from point A to point B. And again, from point A to point B, it was still the Greek culture, so everything was very similar and wherever you went. The diaspora of the Jews continued being spread out. What was more on the east side and beyond of the Mediterranean to the entire Mediterranean world. You have the rebuilding of the temple. A guy named Herod was proclaimed the king of the Jews by Rome. He had some friends in high places, like Mark Antony and stuff. And there were also two more Jewish groups that developed. Again, just like you had anti-Greek culture and pro-Greek culture, you also had anti-Rome and pro-Rome. Okay? Pro-Rome were what were called the publicans, are the Herodians. You've heard of them? And the anti-Rome are the, anybody? Zealots. The zealots. You know, let's get rid of Rome. Let's, whatever way possible to get going. So as you see, again, a lot of times it's like we read the New Testament, we're kind of used to it, but this is the development of all these things and all the setting things up for Jesus coming to the world to one way be accepted, but by those you would think would accept him to reject him. He came into his own, and his own did not receive him. You had the political power. You know, the people in power of the temple, the people in power of the religion of the Jews. They weren't all that religious. They were more about power. And holding on to power. Jesus was a threat because Jesus was the rock that was going to come and hit the feet of the statue and be the beginning of his kingdom being built. Now, that was a ton of information, wasn't it? Now, if you're familiar with it, you know, like, yeah. I want to encourage you to kind of look at this, look at some of the other scriptures. I challenge you to read Daniel chapter 11, and if you can, do it in a study Bible that tells you who's on first and stuff like that. But it's a fascinating history. I wish I had time to go through each one individually, but we're not going to do that because this is, again, an overview. But Nehemiah, temple, 400 years, not so silent. God was preparing the world for Christ. Let's pray. And Jesus, even though Scripture is not being written anymore, but you are still at work. You are still proclaiming through your church the gospel. And God, even though we kind of live in a world system that has a little bit of all of these world powers, we do know that ultimately it's going to blow away as chaff and replaced with you. And God, it will be when you come again, Jesus. And there'll be a great impact as you land on earth again. And just by the words of your mouth, your enemies will be slain. And so Jesus, as we see how you worked in what they call the silent years, God, you work today. So thank you. Thank you that we can take you to this world and share you. I pray in your name. Amen.